So tonight, just a few announcements before we start our talk. So reminder that you can do extra credit for this class by volunteering at D-Town Farm in Detroit. This was our partner for the last 2 years, and this is weekends beginning March 30th, when it's a tiny bit warmer, although it's already getting warm, which is great. So you can volunteer there on Saturdays from 8 to noon or Sundays from 9 to noon. Email Lise to reserve your spot. They like to know if you're coming, just in case they happen to not have a volunteer day that day. And also in the syllabus for the students, it said that you could help, and actually any community members, if you want to do this, could help raise some hoop houses at Oakland Avenue Farm with Mom and Jerry, but we're going to postpone that. So we'll let you know when that's going to happen a little bit later. SFSI, the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, which is our kind of umbrella organization that supports this class, is collaborating with Oakland Avenue Farm and D-Town Farm to offer paid summer internships this summer. More information is coming soon, so watch for that next week. There's also a really exciting global climate strike this Friday. Starts at 11:11. The idea is that in 11 years, if we don't take action on climate change, we're finally going to reach the 2-degree mark increase and face significant challenges. This is an interesting global movement that's really being led by high school students, and it was started by Greta Thunberg from Sweden last year at the age of 15, and it's grown into a global movement, and it's coming to Ann Arbor and to our campus on Friday. So march out of your classes at 11:11 on Friday on the Diag here on Central Campus, and there'll be some really exciting speakers. This Friday in Detroit, there's a really exciting speaker that we had on our list to bring in the future, so maybe we'll bring her again. Leah Penniman is coming, and she's going to be talking about farming while Black. She runs a really exciting farm in upstate New York and has been doing amazing things for a long time. Live polling for community attendees too. For those of you who have never come to one of these, we do iClicker questions, a few in the beginning of class, maybe later. So raise your hand if you don't have an iClicker, if you'd like to participate. And please return these at the end if you're a community member. There's not much else you can do with these iClickers at home. Again, to remind those of you in the audience that are community members, all of these talks are free and open to the public. We just ask you to RSVP each week if you're not enrolled in the course for credit. You can also, if this is the first time you've come, you can actually tell us all of the next talks that are coming up that you'd like to attend and just do this registration process once. We just ask you a few questions about who you are so we know who we're attracting to the class. And we also are offering some shuttles for some of the talks, including tonight's. The next one is going to be for Shirley Sherrod, March 26th, so in a couple of weeks. And then finally, we want to thank our sponsors once again from the School for Environment and Sustainability, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Center for Engaged in Academic Learning, the Center for the Education of Women, Francis and Sidney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, Seed Wayne at Wayne State University, the School of Public Health, and the Urban and Regional Planning Program at Taubman College here at the University of Michigan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lily so she can introduce our speaker tonight.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. So I'm pleased to introduce Anna tonight. And I want to tell you a quick story. So I first met Anna, it was in 2014 when she was here in Michigan to be a keynote speaker for the Ecology Center for their annual dinner. And I was a graduate student at the time, and I reached out with an invitation to have Anna over for breakfast. And never mind that she's the recipient of a James Beard Leadership Award and the Time Magazine Eco's Who's Who, but Anna was not above dining at a graduate student's apartment. So I have closely followed Anna's work since, and I regularly tune into the Real Food Reads podcast, which you should listen to when you have a moment if you haven't already. So for nearly 2 decades, Anna Lappé has been researching, writing, and organizing for food systems change. She's without a question a very influential food systems teacher for many of us. I first learned of her work through Real Food Media's Food Mythbusters video, such as the one called, "Do We Really Need Industrial Agriculture to Feed the World?" Anna is a best-selling author, and she's authored or co-authored 3 books on food, farming, and sustainability. She has contributed to more than a dozen other books, and her most recent book, called Diet for a Hot Planet, The Climate Crisis, and What You Can Do About It, was named an Environmental Book of the Year by Kirkus. Her writing has been featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, and among other outlets. There's so much more that you'd like to know about Anna's decades of impressive work, but I want to turn the evening and the mic over to her very shortly. But before I do, let's just distill a few highlights in the form of a quick clicker question. Okay, so which of the following, so enter BB if you haven't already. For your clickers, enter BB. Which of the following is not true about Anna Lappé? 1, she recently interviewed Sean Sherman. 2, B, her daughters love kale. C, she consults with the Dow Chemical Company to improve their sustainability efforts. D, her work exposes the dangers of marketing junk food to children. And E, her TEDx talks have been watched nearly 1 million times. What do you guys think? I know some of the questions have been easy recently, so I'm hoping this one is tricky, but I don't know. We'll see how good you guys do. Okay, B, her daughters love kale. Wow, I really fooled you guys. I'm pretty sure they do, right, Anna? They do love it, yes. You all are wrong, and in fact, you'll find out that she definitely does not consult with the Dow Chemical Company. So only 10% of you got it. So, and with that, let's see. Before we close here, so some of you are familiar with the work of Anna's mother, Frances Moore Lappé, she was our very first Food Literacy for All speaker here in 2017. Were some of you here for her talk? I see a couple nods. Great, so some of you were here for that. And looking ahead, Anna, we're hoping that we'll be able to invite one of your daughters one year so that we can continue this Lappé legacy and we can get the wisdom from the 3 generations of these amazing women. So please welcome Anna Lappé. Her talk is entitled Island Earth, Reclaiming Planet for People, Diversity, and a Stable Climate.
All right, thank you. Loved that clicker question. It is true. My daughters do love kale, which makes me very happy. But thank you so much for having me here. I have to admit, I have been up since 5 o'clock this morning and just flew in on an airplane, and I'm fighting a cold. So I'm hoping I can enlist all of our collective energy to keep me powered throughout this talk. So I really appreciate all your energy. And I was thinking about what I wanted to share with all of you tonight, and I thought I would kind of begin with a little bit. You heard sort of my bio from Lily, but I wanted to just give you a little bit more of a sense of who I am and where I come from, because I think that really informs everything you're going to hear tonight. So you heard a little bit about my mother, my daughters. Really, when I think about where I come from, I think about my grandmothers. So Ina Screevers on the left and Jeanette Baum on the right. And spent a lot of time with my grandmothers as a girl. And one of the things I think I learned most from them is not to accept the world as it is, but to try to make the world the way you want it to be. So my grandma Ina, she grew up and was raising her family in Fort Worth, Texas, and she and her husband started the first racially integrated Unitarian church in Fort Worth, Texas at the height of McCarthyism, which, as family lore has it, is the main reason why they soon left Fort Worth, Texas, and ended up on a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific for a couple of years, working for the military as a weatherman. My grandfather was a weatherman there. They moved to Wake Island for a couple of years. But that to me was this formational story of my childhood. My grandmother Jeanette, she was a public school teacher and was really involved in what became quite an infamous teachers' strike in Newark, New Jersey, 1970, 1971, where teachers were actually arrested. So my grandmother was one of the teachers arrested sent to jail. They ended up spending 8 days in jail. As legend has it, they might have spent longer in jail, except the word got out that these teachers, who were also organizers, were starting to organize the women in jail when they realized that the women in jail were working for no pay. And so they started teaching literacy classes and working on organizing to get those women to demand that they actually get paid for the dishes that they were cleaning. So I tell the stories of Jeanette and Ina because they are such a huge part of my life and such a huge part of sort of what I bring to the work around food systems change, which is we should not accept the way things are, and we should be trying to organize to create the world that we want to see. I also, of course, come here as the daughter of my mother, Frances Anna Lappé, who Lily mentioned. She is about to celebrate the 50th anniversary edition of her first book she wrote when she was 26 called Diet for a Small Planet. She has been going at this for many, many decades. This is a picture of me and my older brother Anthony on a family vacation. You might notice this does not look like Disneyland. I never got to go to Disneyland. This is outside of Antigua, Guatemala, where my mother had dragged us on one of her research trips about U.S. involvement in Central America. So this was, again, kind of part of my story of who I am and what I bring to this work. So what I want to talk to you all about tonight is a lot of things, so I hope that you will stick with me throughout the evening. We're going to talk about a lot of things, and I want to start, and I'll go back to the first slide because this is a picture from it. I want to start in Hawaii. So kind of like my mother, I dragged my children along on a research trip, but it was to Hawaii. They were not complaining. But we traveled to Hawaii because I've been working with some groups that were organizing on the islands of Hawaii. How many of you have ever been to Hawaii? Yeah, how many of you want to go to Hawaii? So, I think whether you've been there or not, this is one of the most, beautiful, biologically diverse, amazing places on the planet. What you might not know is that in the past decade or two, Hawaii has become ground zero for the development of and the testing of new genetically modified organisms. So most of the seed corn, GMO seed corn grown in the U.S. is tested and developed on the islands of Hawaii, particularly Kauai, which is where we went. Now, this picture is taken on the very lush, wet north shore of Hawaii, where the tourists go. Where do you think the agricultural chemical companies are testing their seeds and spraying their pesticides? Not where the tourists go, exactly, to the west side, the dry west side, and the home to almost all of the native Hawaiian who live on Kauai, and is not where the tourists go. So shortly after this picture was taken, I was at this, sort of hipster, touristy wine bar with my husband and kids for the non-work portion of my time in Hawaii, and I started chatting with the waitress, and I explained why I was there, and I said, I was there to learn about the impacts of the world's largest chemical companies on the island, and that had made Kauai ground zero for this GMO seed development and pesticide testing. And this waitress kind of leaned in close to my family, and she said, I know exactly what you're talking about. She said, my best friend just had her first baby, and the baby was born with his intestines outside of his body. And I knew exactly what she was talking about. It's a birth defect called gastroschisis that many associate with in utero exposure to pesticides in the fields. And many of the organizers that I had been talking to had said that that they were detecting anecdotally an uptick in these birth defects, but a number of other health effects from the exposure of pesticides on the islands. And it was, this moment sitting there in this wine bar that really did feel worlds away from the west side of Kauai, but of course, nothing is far away on an island, right? And I came to learn over the course of my time there in Kauai that what had happened is that as the sugar and pineapple plantations had left those islands to go elsewhere to find cheaper labor in other parts of the world, these chemical companies, predominantly Dow, but many others, and yes, I do not consult for Dow. You maybe pick up on that theme over the course of the evening. But this is a shot from the west side. This is an image I took of one of Dow's headquarters there on the islands. And they were drawn to Hawaii for three main reasons. So why of all the places in the world is this happening here in Kauai? Number one, they were drawn there because of the climate. They can have year-round growing seasons, so they're more productive. Number two, they were drawn there because of this long history of exploitive plantation economy, where the communities had become so dependent on industrial agriculture that there was a turnkey both of the land, but also a turnkey of labor, and that the labor had been so exploited and so dependent on those corporations that it was very hard to organize labor in that part of the island. And number three, there was not a whole lot of regulation happening. The nearest EPA office, guess where the nearest EPA office is to this spot in the west side of Kauai? All the way over in San Francisco. So very little regulation at the same time, and a lot of political capture. I heard a lot about how there was folks who were representing industry, the folks that had ties to industry, representing the counties on the county council, for instance. So what I heard about is that in the wake of the introduction of these chemicals, here is an aerial shot where you can see where the production is happening. You can see those farm fields. And what do you notice about how close they are to the communities? They're right there. There is no buffer zone. There is no exclusion zone. If you're a daycare center or an elementary school or a hospital, there is no buffer zone. There was no requirement for there to be even any warning about what was being sprayed. There was no requirement for companies to even disclose what they sprayed and when they sprayed it. And what I was hearing from community members is that there was an uptick in and I mentioned birth defects, but also cancers. One woman told me that on her block, almost every kid now had a nebulizer because of asthma rates were going up. One of the things that I remember really noticing, if you've ever been to Hawaii, you will notice the incredible wind that blows through, the trade winds that blow across the islands. So of course the drift. Not only are you literally right next to those fields, but even if you weren't right next to those fields, the drift from those pesticides would of course impact you. And so I start here because this is a part of a much bigger story about how did we get here? How did we get to a place where we have turned one of the most beautiful biodiverse places in the planet into a place that is toxic for the people who are living there? How do we get to a place where the way we are growing food, and now in many parts of the world, but certainly the predominant way we grow food in this country, is dependent on chemical pesticides, which we increasingly have evidence do things like disrupt our hormones, lead to certain cancers, damage our brains, affect the IQ of children who are exposed in utero, or exposed when they're babies or when they're young. That we have found that certain pesticides can lead to ADHD and other neurodevelopmental problems, or Parkinson's, depression. And I think this, to me, is this question I'm going to explore tonight. How did we get here? But then also, how do we not accept this? How do we say, no, we want the world to look differently? And I'm going to suggest that the story about how we got here is really a story about power. It's a story about politics. It's a story about racism. It's a story about capitalism. It really cuts to the heart also of what we believe our role is as human beings on the planet and what our relationship is to the birds and the bees and the fish and the frogs. And what I also want to share tonight is that this is also a story of movements emerging all around the world, throughout this country, movements emerging to, again, say it doesn't have to be this way. There is another way, and when we organize together, we can bring that other existence into being. And I also want to say this is a story that really touches me personally, and I don't know if this is true for any of you here, but for like so many of us, it's a story that's really connected to my family in really the most intimate of ways. My father died of cancer, of glioblastoma brain cancer. My mother survived breast cancer. My grandfather had prostate cancer. My grandmother Ina, who you saw in that picture, she died of leukemia. My grandmother Jeanette, who I mentioned, died of thyroid cancer. My youngest daughter has had 2 surgeries to treat 2 different birth defects. Now, do I know if any one of those cancers was related to any possible pesticide exposure? Of course I don't know. I can't know. That's part of this story. And yet, I feel that sense that it leaves us with this question, and certainly with this knowledge, that we currently live in a world where these chemicals are all around us, and there is not a child born today without pesticide residues of some level in their body. So this is the journey I'm going to take you on of sort of how do we get here, and what am I finding hope from in ways people are organizing to fight back. And this story, to go in the Wayback Machine just a little bit, goes back to war. So the pesticides that we live with today, most of them were born during World War II, not all of them. And they were born for two reasons. They were born in part as insecticides were born to really help to fight back against lice and malaria, things that were impacting the military. But also they were born as nerve gases. They were born as experiments around actually warfare. And when the war ended, these companies that had been making a lot of profit in the war effort started looking at, well, where else are there a lot of insects? Where else are there ways that these chemicals can actually be used and we can continue making profit? And what was born was the modern day kind of chemical industry, and the pesticide industry was born. And what was born was really a convincing of farmers that this was a tool that would ultimately be profitable for them, that would ultimately help them. And what we saw, and again, this is the pesticide industry was born then, and we also saw at the same time a huge increase in the synthetic fertilizers that industrial agriculture is also so dependent on. And what we saw is, with the introduction of these chemicals, a real shift away from the biodiversity that you have on farms that allow farms to regulate their insect populations naturally. And you start moving to monocultures. And when you do that, it creates kind of a vicious cycle. Well, you need these pesticides to deal with the pest because you don't have ways you're dealing with them naturally any longer. And really, pretty early on in this birth of this sort of modern day chemical, this modern day chemical practices in agriculture, we saw a lot of people raising questions. Talking about this vicious cycle that farmers would get on, talking about this pesticide treadmill, where what happened is you would start seeing, you'd introduce a chemical, pests would get resistant, you'd introduce a weed killer, the weeds would get resistance, and we started seeing that pesticide treadmill really, really early on. And we started seeing, despite that pesticide treadmill, we started seeing a huge increase in the amount of pesticides being used. Today, by 2023, I just looked at the numbers, and it's looking like the pesticide industry by 2023 will be a $90 billion, that's with a B, a $90 billion industry globally, and the synthetic fertilizer industry will be a $245 billion industry. And I raise those two numbers because as you hear me talk tonight about the alternatives, understand the incredible, powerful financial vested interest in continuing to have farmers dependent on these chemicals. We've seen an incredible increase, as I said, in pesticide use. This slide shows you just since 1990, just how much pesticide use has increased globally. We've also seen, with the introduction of genetically modified organisms, a huge increase in certain pesticides going up. So when genetically modified organisms were first commercialized, one of the promises that we heard is that they might decrease, or they would decrease, pesticide use on the farm. But we've actually seen a different story depending on which pesticide you're looking at. And what's important to know about GMOs that have been commercialized to date is really, when you look at the marketplace, they have been designed to express just one of two traits, or they've been designed to do both. So we've heard a lot of promises about different things that they could do, that they might do, that they will do, but really they've been just doing these one or both of these two things. So they've either been engineered with a gene from a soil bacterium to produce a protein toxic to certain insects. That's one of the traits that has been engineered. Or they've been engineered to be resistant to a weed killer or an herbicide. Or they are layered to do both of those traits. And when you look at the GMO acreage today in the US, 98% of it is GMOs that include the trait, either solely or as part of it, include the trait to withstand one or more weed killer. 98%. So this next slide, I sort of want to really explain that so that you understand that this next slide should not come as a surprise. This is the USDA data on the increase in glyphosate, which is in glyphosate-based herbicides. It's a kind of weed killer. If you notice over here, I don't know if there's a little thing to show you, but over here, you notice this year what happened. Kind of went up a lot. That was the mid-1990s was when GMOs were commercialized, and you saw this incredible increase of glyphosate used. And why does this matter? And we'll talk about this a little bit later. One of the reasons why I find this graph particularly shocking is what we've been learning in the past couple years from scientists around the world who've been raising some pretty serious health concerns about glyphosate. It had been sort of pitched as a very harmless weed killer to use for home use and for farmers to use. Many farmers who I've talked to who don't use any other toxic pesticides would use glyphosate because they believed the messaging that it was relatively safe. But we have a lot of really good science coming out that's actually now potentially connecting glyphosate-based herbicides with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There are currently 11,000 farmers and pesticide applicators who are suing the company that most produces glyphosate-based herbicides, which is Bayer, since Bayer recently purchased Monsanto. So we've seen this incredible increase in the amount of pesticides and herbicides being used. And what's important to understand about this increase is things like these health impacts. What does it mean to our health that this weed killer is now being used so predominantly across GMO soy, which is that top bar, GMO corn, cotton, but not just that. It's also in that little clicker box is blocking it, but this little purple line here is wheat. It's kind of an off-label use, but it's used by some farmers at the tail end of commercial wheat production that will spray it with glyphosate as a desiccant. It dries it out quicker. And so there have been some testing done on breakfast cereals and breads finding glyphosate residues there. So what are these impacts of this incredible increase? And I focus on glyphosate, but there are 17,000 different pesticide formulations in use today. So I don't only want to talk about this one. So what are some of the consequences? Well, I mentioned, number one, you've already heard me talk about the human health implications, right? One of the pesticides you'll hear me talk about today, what's been a huge issue in the Hawaiian Islands, is a pesticide called chlorpyrifos, which is an insecticide. So just by way of a lexicon here, if you hear the word pesticide, that covers all of the universe of agricultural chemicals. It includes insecticides to kill insects, fungicides to kill fungus. It includes herbicides to kill weeds, and so it includes it all. Okay, so chlorpyrifos, for instance, is an insecticide that has been around for decades and decades. It actually was one of those chemicals that was introduced, used as a nerve gas during World War II. It is among the most widely used agricultural pesticides in the US today. Dow actually sells more than 5 million pounds of it every year. But it is also known to be a brain-damaging chemical. I mean, it was designed as a nerve gas after all, but a brain-damaging chemical which experts say has no safe level for children. And in fact, in 2001, it was banned for indoor home use. So it was used I lived for 17 years in New York City, so I can relate to this use a little bit. It was used to get rid of cockroaches indoors. In 2001, the medical community was finally able to organize enough pressure on regulators to ban it for indoor use, but it is still used agriculturally, and it is used in the Hawaiian Islands. So there's the health impacts, and I mentioned chlorpyrifos is, again, just one example of the kinds of pesticides that are impacting our health. And there's also the environmental impact of pesticides and synthetic fertilizer. One of the biggest impacts here is the incredible amount of environmental impact that our synthetic fertilizer has, in particular on creating dead zones all around the world. In the United States, our dead zone is in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is as a result of leaching synthetic fertilizer from farmland predominantly, and it leaches into the waterways, and it creates this vast crisis of water pollution where no aquatic life can thrive. There are now more than 400 oceanic dead zones around the world. And in 2017, as you can see here, our Gulf of Mexico dead zone grew to about the size of New Jersey. So that's one example of the environmental impact. But of course, what I also like to stress is this isn't just about how we might be impacted by chemical pesticides with residues in the food we eat or in our environment. Of course, this is also about how communities are affected in the places where these pesticides are getting manufactured. So I know I'm here in Michigan. I don't know how many of you have followed the impact of the Dow manufacturing plant in Midland, Michigan. It's its biggest manufacturing plant. I see some heads nodding. The last I looked into some of the organizing work that was being done around the pollution that Dow facility was creating. The organizers were citing government data that was showing that the waterways near Dow's chemical manufacturing plant in Midland, Michigan had some of the highest levels of cancer-causing dioxin in their water of anywhere in the country. So when we talk about what are the impacts of these chemicals, it is also the impacts of those communities that live in the shadow of those manufacturing plants, as well as the communities like those on the west side of Kauai that are impacted when those pesticides are used on farmland. And then this is one of the other impacts that I think is so critical for us to understand. To me is, if I really am honest about what's keeping me up at night, this is one of the things that keeps me up at night. I don't know how many of you saw this study that just got released last month. Anybody saw this study? This data comes from this amazing study. If anybody wants to be kept up at night with this worry also, read the study. It was out of researchers out of the University of Sydney and China Agricultural University in Beijing. And it was the first study to try to pull together all the data we have around the planet of how insect populations are declining. So it was a meta-analysis. So they, in the end, analyzed more than 70 studies. And what they found was so alarming. One of the articles where they interviewed the researcher, they said, you use for academics, your language is quite alarming. And he said, that is because the data is very alarming. And essentially what they found is that if we don't halt the causes and the drivers behind insect population decline, we could potentially have no insects left on the planet in 100 years. And what they found, and you can see on this chart, is that they found that globally insect species populations were declining at remarkable rates, especially in the last 10 years. Anybody know what caddisflies are and why that might be particularly upsetting that this number is so high for caddisflies? I showed this slide to my 9-year-old daughter, and she was like, well, Mom, you got to explain what is a caddisfly, and why should anybody care about caddisflies? Well, caddisflies, if you've ever gone fly fishing or fishing, they're like one of the things you put on the end of your hook because fish love them. Why do they love them? They're aquatic insects. They are the base of the food web for so many animals. We lose our caddisflies. We don't just lose the thing you can put at the end of your fish hook when you go fishing. You really lose this critical piece of the entire food web. And of course, insects are also important because they are really important for nutrient cycling. When animals die and plant matter decays, insects are there to do that nutrient cycling. We lose our insects, we lose that. And of course, I think the insects we have heard the most about probably are the pollinators, right? They are so important because 1 out of every 3 bites we take as a human species is dependent on pollinators. Pretty critical. And when these researchers looked at, well, what's driving this? Why are we seeing this incredible insect decline? They pointed to a number of things, urbanization, climate change, but really what they realized was the most significant driver was the use of pesticides in agriculture. And essentially they said, unless we change our ways of producing food, insects as a whole will go down the path of extinction in a few decades. The repercussions for the planet's ecosystems are catastrophic. Now, I'm in a university hall here, and I think many of you are researchers and academics, so I think you can understand that for academics to speak in such powerful terms means that they are standing on really solid evidence about this crisis. Okay, so if everything I've said so far is so true, that we're seeing this incredible impacts of these chemicals are affecting human health and communities. They're affecting, of course, the farmers and farm workers. They're affecting the environment. They're affecting essentially kind of world as we know it. And they're trapping farmers into these treadmills where farmers actually are finding that they're having to spend more money on even more chemicals and they're trapped in that treadmill. It kind of begs the question of why are we still so locked in to this system that is not serving life on the planet? And this is where I think it's important to talk about the power of narratives, of what we hold to be true, what we hold to be possible, and why we have certain technologies expanding and not others. So I don't know if any of you have studied the work of Langdon Winter. He's a technology theorist and philosopher. But I love this quote of his because I think we tend to have this idea in our culture that the innovations that take off in the marketplace, the technology that spreads is the best. It's the most efficient. It's the most effective. Instead of understanding that so much of the technology that we see around us emerges because of very political reasons. And so I'll read to you this quote because it's, I think, a lot to kind of get into our minds, but it gets at what I'm trying to express here, which is Langdon Winter writes, "Technologies embody specific forms of power and authority. There is an ongoing social process in which scientific knowledge, technological innovation, and corporate profit reinforce each other in deeply entrenched patterns that bear the unmistakable stamp of political and economic power." So what I'm saying is, we don't have a multi-billion-dollar pesticide industry on the planet because we absolutely need it in order to feed ourselves. What I'm arguing is that we have seen the spread of this technology because of this incredible political and economic power that the companies at the heart of this technology wield in our society. And what we're seeing is that power increasingly growing. So this next slide shows the incredible consolidation we're seeing in the seed and chemical industry. So increasingly the companies that are selling commercial seed are also in the chemical industry. And those companies are buying up a lot of smaller companies. If you want to really nerd out on this, I recommend the work of Professor Phil Howard, who has done some amazing mapping of the consolidation in industry. And you can see change over time. This is just a snapshot of this moment, but you can see how this consolidation has happened. If any of you are economists in this room, you will know that any good economist will tell you, as soon as you have 4 companies or fewer controlling 40% or more of a market, you don't have real competition anymore. So you can see, do we have that in the seed and the chemical industry? No, we don't. And what happens when you have this consolidation of power is all kinds of distortions of the marketplace. So you see some of these companies, when I went into the financial 10Ks of Monsanto a few years ago, what you see is some of these companies do things like buy up smaller companies that might have some really innovative ideas, and they buy them up to do what? To kill them. So you might have heard how music companies do this. The music industry does this all the time. A new star is coming up that sounds a lot like one of their best-selling stars. They'll sign them, and then they'll never produce an album with that star. Or that will never be a star with that singer. So it's that same kind of practice to actually kill innovation. And what we also see, of course, is how these companies can really increasingly influence regulation and policy. So I did the math on comparing how many members of Congress we have to how many registered agribusiness lobbyists we had in 2017. That number shocked me. But so just take a look at that and let that sink in about what kind of influence that could mean that these companies have over regulation, over, say, where research dollars goes, or where subsidies are going, or whether a chemical like chlorpyrifos is allowed to be used for farming or not. All of these things impact it. So when you look at the fact that Dow spent $250,000 on the Republican National Convention in 2016, and then another $250,000 on the inaugural committee, maybe it will come as no surprise when you read the New York Times articles about how the EPA, despite its own science, the EPA under the Trump administration decided not to ban chlorpyrifos for agricultural uses. So remember those words of Langdon Winter. To me, this is the stamp of economic and political power on what technology continues to be in the marketplace, what technology we regulate, what technology we don't regulate. But the other reason why I think it's really important to talk about sort of power and politics, it's not just this direct influence on regulation, on policy, on what types of industries are getting subsidies and not. It's that these companies and these industries are also spending a lot of resources on shaping that narrative we hold about the world as it is. So Marshall Gantz has this great quote I've always loved where he's talking about social movements. And he says social movements have narratives, they tell stories because they are not just about rearranging economics and politics, they're also about rearranging meaning. But I would argue that the companies that are selling their products are also very much in that meaning-making business. They're very much in that process of getting us to buy a certain narrative. To buy the narrative that we need those products or we're not going to be able to feed ourselves, that farmers need those products or they're not going to be profitable, that we shouldn't worry about those products because the science is wrong about the human health harm, those kinds of narratives. And this narrative also, it goes, I would say, even deeper than that to what we really understand nature to be and our role in the natural world. And the narrative that we hear from the pesticide industry is a narrative that our role as human beings is a role to conquer nature, to control it. So it didn't surprise me when you look at some of the brand names of some of the pesticides. They're called things like Predator and Harness. And they're here to, and they talk about their product lines as an arsenal. They use all this kind of war metaphor. And it's a story about us human beings being able to tackle these complex natural systems by just taking their tiny parts apart and addressing that one tiny part and not thinking in terms of systems. It's also a story about nature being very sort of competitive and wild, and it's up to us to kind of tame it. It's a story of this vast web of a chemical industry denial machine, denying this health harm, denying this environmental harm, denying this community harm. It's a story that even Rachel Carson, I think, was able to identify as a kind of, as she put it, a Neanderthal age way of looking at biology and philosophy. This idea that sort of nature is just there for us to control and tame it. And she wrote in Silent Spring, she said, "It is our alarming misfortune that so primitive a science has armed itself with the most modern and terrible weapons, and that in turning them against the insects, it has also turned them against the earth." And one of the things about narrative is that what makes them so powerful is almost that we don't even realize that they are constructed around us. They're like the ether we breathe. We don't even notice all the ways they permeate our culture. They permeate our mainstream reporting on food, farming, and agriculture. They permeate the way we tell stories about, as I said, what nature is. And I was thinking about this the other day when I was watching an episode of Planet Earth. Has anybody watched and listened to David Attenborough's Planet Earth? I see some people nodding. So should I try to do his British accent? I don't think so. But I turned it on the other day. Maybe I will. This is being recorded, I think. Well, maybe we'll edit this part out. So just listen to his words. So this is, again, trying to get at this point I'm trying to make, that this narrative about what nature is, that it's competitive, that we have to control it, that we can't just let it exist and flourish on farms. We need to attack it with our chemical arsenal. It's in our pop culture, too. So I turned on this Planet Earth episode the other day, and it was the Jungles episode, and it opened literally with these lines, and I almost was laughing out loud because I was like, this is exactly my point. So he goes, will I try an accent? Jungles are lush paradises, he says. And this like opening scene of this amazingly beautiful jungle, and he was like, dense, crowded places where spider monkeys, jaguars, and even river dolphins must compete to survive. Paradise is crowded. Life fills every niche, and at any one time, a staggering variety of species and countless individuals are striving for space and food. Every jungle animal must find their own way to survive in the most competitive place on Earth. Okay, this is why I do this work, and I'm not an actress or something. But so just listen to those words. I mean, yes, of course, nature's crowded, David Attenborough. That's a good thing. It's called biodiversity. And, this idea that all the birds and the bees and the spider monkeys and the jaguars are competing against each other, it's exactly this worldview that I'm talking about, that I'm arguing we need to upend. And there's this really other way of understanding nature, which is that it is cooperative. It is mutualistic, that it thrives in its diversity, and that this cooperation is its organizing principle. And that if you as a farmer can tap into that mutualism, tap into that beauty of that cooperation, you can have a thriving farm without needing to bust out your chemical weapons. And I was reading this quote to a colleague of mine who works a lot with the biomimicry movement, the Biomimicry Institute, which is this school of thought and this body of work that designs materials and structures and systems modeled off of the biological entities and processes you find in nature. And so I was telling her that David Attenborough quote, and she was cracking up as well. And she said, of course, yes, Anna, yes, paradise is crowded. She said, but yes, there's incredible mutualism. So she gave me this beautiful example of the jungle orchid, which is, comes in all these different shapes and colors and sizes, and it's amazing. And she described how these jungle orchids co-evolved with bees in the jungle. So bees in the jungle where these jungle orchids thrive, they can pollinate as many as 11 different species across the course of their pollination path. And what the orchids and the bees have done is develop this mutualism where each orchid has evolved a unique position for its pollen collectors so that it enables the bees to deposit just the pollen only from its other species sisters as it goes along its path, and allows that pollination to happen while allowing the diversity of species to thrive. I mean, this is just one tiny example, right, of expressing that incredible mutualism that is at the heart of nature. And that species co-evolved with this kind of adaptation to thrive in biodiversity. And it's this understanding of really nature and the natural world being codependent and mutually supportive, which is at the heart of this other worldview of food and farming and agriculture, which is an ecological one. And it is also, I would argue, the foundation of indigenous wisdom and indigenous understanding of how natural food systems can work. It's a wisdom, I would also argue, that has been systemically attacked, destroyed, and denigrated by colonial powers and by Western domination. We certainly saw that in Hawaii when I talked with the folks that are organizing on the islands there against these pesticide companies. They were reminding me that before Hawaii was occupied, it was entirely self-sufficient in its food systems, with a population, they would note, almost as big as the population of Hawaii today. Whereas Hawaii today, 95% of their food is imported. So I One of my favorite books, you could maybe bring her to one of your Food Literacy for All seminars if you haven't already, Braiding Sweetgrass. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, talks about this mutualism in nature and talks about this mutualism that was really at the heart of the ecological farming systems that her community has evolved over centuries. And she told me this story, I think many of you might be familiar with if you're familiar with Native American agriculture, of the mutualism of the three sisters, as they're called, of corn and beans and squash, and how by growing together they're able to thrive much better than they would alone. So for instance, why? Well, the corn, it stands upright. Of course, it's able to get access to all that light, but it's nutrient limited. But then you have the beans that are able to use the corn as a scaffolding to grow, twining up the ladder of the corn, and underground they're fixing the nitrogen that feeds the corn. And then you have the third sister, the squash, which has those big umbrella leaves that shade the soil, keep it moist, and suppress the weeds. Its prickly leaves also help keep those insect herbivores away. As Kimmerer says, she says, they're not in competition, they're complementary. They help each other out like sisters do, she said. And of course, in the end, they produce more than if they were to grow alone. So this ecological worldview is the one that really calls into question the fundamental reason for being of this total reliance on chemicals in agriculture. And yet it is also this threat to this huge multi-billion-dollar industry that is predicted only to grow. So with that, as we move into kind of what we're all going to do about this, I've come to our first clicker question, which should be maybe not the trickiest of my questions. So get out your clickers. And Lily, you can tell me how long to give people. Or it'll pop up. Okay, great. Oh, I see. It has like a timer. Gives like 30 seconds. Dun, dun, dun. Will it pop up now? Oh. Oh, you click it. Okay. Okay, so yes, you guys, I gave you a really easy one to start with. Yes, and of course, many more things, but yes, okay, just a little refresher. Clearly, you all are hip to about why insects are so important. Okay, so okay. I talked in the beginning about Ina and Jeanette, my beloved grandmothers, and about how they instilled in me this way of approaching the world, which is we do not have to accept the things that we see around us that are unjust, that make us angry, that we can do something about it. So in my last little bit of time, and I want to save time for questions too, I want to talk about some of those strategies, and I'll talk about them briefly. Each of these we could talk about for a very long time. So I want to talk about the importance of building support for the movements that are really undergirding this alternative way of farming that is so important. I want to talk about some of the another strategy to really address the consumer-facing brands that are potentially using those chemicals. Third, kind of how do we counter that narrative change work? Fourth, how do we win policy to really change the landscape? And then 5, how do we catalyze political power? So, a lot to cover. The reason why I want to talk about all of this, though, is ultimately all 5 of these strategies, and of course the many more strategies we could deploy, ultimately what I believe, and many of us believe, and if that little clicker box wasn't there, you would see this is a graph I got from my colleagues from the Heal Food Alliance. And they, like I, like to think of movements as about building power that are shifting the cultural norms and also political structures to create transformative change. And if this could be a graph that was moving, you would see ultimately what we were trying to do is say that this purple circle is the way things are, and when people say, oh, this is what's politically possible right now. What movements do is actually move all of us to, I'm sorry, this is politically kind of realistic. What we want to do is move all of us to what is politically possible, that is today considered politically impossible. So consider that in 2016, when candidate Bernie Sanders was talking about Medicare for all, everybody said, Medicare for all, that's politically impossible. We're never going to get there. Today, Representative Pramila Jayapal and her Medicare for All bill has 100 endorsers in the House of Representatives. So that was about movements over these past couple of years that moved that circle over to make what seemed impossible possible. So one of the ways that I think we're going to move that circle is through really supporting a lot of the farmer-led movements around the world that are embracing this different way of farming and showing that you do not need to use chemical agriculture to feed the world. And what we're seeing increasingly around the world is farmers and scientists and experts worldwide are really proving this story, proving that you can farm this way, that it is better for farmers, it is better for the environment, it is better for eaters, and they're really sort of taking on this narrative. And this work has been going on, of course, for decades and decades, and the science undergirding it just increasingly tells a story. One of the most, I think, important reports that came out really to tell this global story about why we need to support these movements and the benefits that they hold was a report called Agriculture at the Crossroads with this acronym IAASTD. How many of you have ever heard of the international, you have heard of it, Catherine, I'm sure, or maybe were you one of the experts on it? What's that? Yvette was, yeah. So this is a report called the International Assessment for Agriculture, Science, and Technology for Development, or IAASTD. It is both a mouthful and then an acronym that, unless you're working on like public health, having STD in your acronym might not be the best idea. But it was written by 600 experts from 110 countries, and it assessed what are the best agricultural methods to address all of these multiplicity of issues we face, addressing hunger, addressing health, addressing environmental issues. And essentially what they say is a way of farming that doesn't lock us into reliance on chemical pesticides and reliance on synthetic fertilizer is so vital to the future of human health, of ending hunger, of environmental stability, of climate stability. And what we're seeing is these kinds of messages that report put out increasingly being taken up by movements around the world. In 1993, a farmers movement started, a global farmers movement started called La Via Campesina. It now has farmers in 73 countries, farmers networks in 73 countries, representing 200 million farmers. And they're calling for a way of farming that, again, liberates farmers from that dependency on chemical pesticides. And it's a way of farming that, again, taps into that understanding of natural systems, that taps into understanding that when you tap into natural systems, you unleash abundance, you foster resilience, and you create a kind of, instead of that vicious cycle I talked about with chemical dependency, a kind of virtuous cycle. This is a quote from that insect population study that I said was so amazing, that essentially underscores the same message, that in many of the world's farming systems, biological controls constitute an underused yet cost-effective means to resolve agricultural pest problems while conserving biodiversity both on-farm and beyond the field border. Another study that I think has been really powerful that I like to mention a lot is the study that they looked, these researchers at the University of Essex looked at agricultural projects in 57 countries and found that shifting toward more agroecological practices actually really helped those farms and it actually increased yields. So we're seeing this kind of farming getting increasing support around the world. For the very first time last year, I think the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization had a symposium on agroecology. I'm an advisor and work with a global network of funders called the Agroecology Fund that's supporting that sort of trifecta of agroecology of the farmers that are doing the practice on the ground and the movement leaders that are moving it from the movement side and the scientists and the academics that are pushing it in the academy and really helping all of those three parts of that triangle all work together to really move these practices forward. Okay, the second strategy I want to talk about is targeting consumer-facing brands, or sort of direct action to companies And these can be direct actions we're seeing consumers are taking against a company where they're finding that, calling on companies to use more organic products, calling on a company to put more ingredients in their products that aren't raised with pesticides. This slide is from a story from CBS this morning from a couple months ago about Roundup, which is, again, the brand name for the glyphosate-based herbicide that is Monsanto's biggest source of profit. And I should note, Monsanto is now owned by Bayer, so Monsanto effectively no longer exists as its own company. But I will note, I grabbed this slide the other day, but this segment was done a few months ago. Those 200 lawsuits are now 11,000 lawsuits of farmers or pesticide applicators who have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and are suing the company. After the first case, the first pesticide applicator, this is a picture of him, Dwayne Lee Johnson. After that went to court and the jury found Monsanto guilty of negligence and found that this man's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was likely associated with his use of glyphosate-based weed killer. A bunch of activists said, okay, let's do a targeted campaign to the companies that are still selling Roundup. So even though the jury really clearly saw the science and said, yes, it looks like there's this link between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and Roundup, that did not change anything overnight in the marketplace. Every Home Depot, Costco, Lowe's, they're all still selling it. So how are we going to make that change in the marketplace? One of the strategies is to go to those companies directly and say, do the right thing here. And Costco was the first company to agree to discontinue using Roundup. We're not using it, selling it. Okay, next clicker slide. It's a little trickier. Before we get to the third strategy, next clicker slide. When the chemical giants Dow and DuPont merged, the corporations rebranded the agricultural, chemical, and seed components of their business with which of the following names? A, Humana, B, Altria, C, Corteva, or D, Inspira? And I know this is a bit trickier. Okay, so it looks like about a quarter of you thought maybe Humana, about a quarter of you thought maybe Altria, about half Corteva, and a few Inspira. So Inspira, I just made that up because it sounds like some kind of corporate brand. Humana is a health insurance company. Altria, anybody want to say what Altria's name used to be? Philip Morris, yeah. So Philip Morris spent millions of dollars rebranding themselves as Altria. And Dow DuPont rebranded themselves as Corteva, which they say they came to that name because Cor as in heart and Teva as in earth, Corteva. So the agricultural chemical brands, Dow and DuPont, no longer exist. They're now Corteva. Okay, so what's the third strategy I want to talk about? And again, because we're coming up on time, I'm just going to go through these really quickly. But the third is this narrative change work. So I argued that the narrative matters. What we are told, what we believe needs to shift. We need to shift people's hearts and minds. That IAASTD report that I mentioned earlier, nobody had heard of it except Catherine Badgley here and a few others. That's no accident. That wasn't an accident that none of us ever heard of this amazing report that should really be helping us guide agricultural policy. 57 countries signed on to that study, not the United States. 2 agricultural chemical companies were involved early on in the production of that report, but they actually pulled out of the production when they realized that the findings were going to kind of not really look so good for them, and they ended up writing a bunch of scathing op-eds in The Economist and other media outlets, and it really wasn't covered here. I wouldn't have heard about it if this wasn't the work that I do. So part of it is, how do we get these stories into our consciousness? How do we do that narrative change? And I would argue the other piece of that narrative change work is to then hold our media institutions accountable. Hold them accountable so that they aren't inadvertently part of essentially the narrative formation work that these industries are trying to do to normalize themselves. And so for instance, last year, The Atlantic does these live events, and they did one where they had it sponsored by Dow DuPont, or now, we all know, what's its name? Corteva. Then it was still Dow DuPont, and it was called Harvest, Transforming the Food We Eat, and it was all about the future of food, sponsored by this chemical agriculture company. So I was like, this is outrageous, and I ended up actually speaking to people at The Atlantic, and they said, well, as a media institution, we think it's important to make sure that people hear both sides of the story. Yeah, I said, well, hearing both sides of the story doesn't mean you have your event underwritten by a company which has a very specific side of the story. And they said, well, another person I talked to said, oh, Anna, it's important that we bring people together who have different views so we have difficult conversations. Well, I watched the live stream of this event, and the representative from Dow DuPont who got up there and was able to give this really, really beautiful opening speech and this really beautiful panel. Was there a single difficult conversation? Did anybody there say, excuse me, sir, would you like to speak to the live audience out in those cameras, out to the world? Would you like to talk about how your company, over decades, has never given any serious reparations to the people in Bhopal, India, who many of whom died, and many were injured at the time, and many have suffered generations of birth defects because your company that you bought there in Bhopal, India, cut costs in your pesticide manufacturing facility, so there was an accident that created one of the worst industrial accidents in human history. Do you think anybody had that difficult conversation with him there? No, it didn't happen. So I and many of us were really frustrated by what is the narrative we hear when an event like this happens, and so we couldn't convince The Atlantic to rethink partnering with Dow DuPont for something like this. What we did do was we got the folks in Hawaii who have been so impacted by Dow DuPont to write a public letter. Pesticide Action Network, a really fabulous group across the world in the United States, Pesticide Action North America wrote a public letter. The Bhopal Medical Action Group, the activists in Bhopal that have been working to try to get some restitution from the impact there. They wrote a public letter, and then we did something which, was a small thing, but it was satisfying. The Atlantic Lives event had a hashtag, Atlantic Harvest, during their live stream for the several hours, and the entire hashtag live stream was just filled with dozens and dozens of people having the, sort of pointing out things like, Dow DuPont has a history of suppressing science and covering up health harms. For instance, Teflon toxin, DuPont and the chemical industry deception, with a link to the Intercept article about it, that kind of thing. So in a way, this is a small sort of narrative change moment, but I think it's really important even in these small moments that none of us let this slide by, that we hold our media institutions accountable, because this is when that narrative formation work happens. Okay, I have to breeze through the next two strategies. This is one I'm particularly excited about, which is, how do we fight for policy wins? Even if we can't win at the national level, how do we keep winning at the local level, at the state level? This is a picture from the university very close to me in Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley. And one of the things that I was really excited about is a colleague of mine, a young woman who was a beach volleyball player at UC Berkeley, got kind of activated around these issues when she was told one day, she was out at practice, and the coach said to the women on the team, hey, if you knock a ball off court, don't run after it today, because they just sprayed herbicide around the court. So you might just, let those balls lie. And she and her classmates said, what? And her teammate said, kind of, this isn't the campus we want. This isn't the world we want. We want to be able to run after the ball and not worried about being exposed to a toxic herbicide. So she and a bunch of her fellow students and staff at the university started Herbicide-Free Cal, and they actually got the university to go herbicide-free, and she's now working across the entire UC system with students who are activated across the whole UC system to go herbicide-free. Miami just recently banned the herbicide, this glyphosate-based herbicide I've been talking about because of their environmental concerns. And again, it's this example of what we can do at the local level or at the city level to really make change happen. Okay, last clicker question, and then one last strategy, and then time for questions. So, last clicker question. The world's, okay, so this shouldn't be hard if you were paying attention, because the answer was in my earlier remarks. The world's 3 largest seed agrochemical companies now control what portion of the global market? Is it A, roughly 1/4, B, about 1/3, C, nearly 2/3, or is it D, 3/4? Okay, good. Good listening, everybody. Yes, so it was nearly 2/3. Although when I was making that slide, I realized the data was, I think it was 2018. I feel like there's even been some more consolidation since that slide, so that number might keep going up. But yes, good listening. Okay, so the last strategy, catalyze political power. Last and, of course, most important. So back in Hawaii, those communities who were seeing the impact of pesticides in their community, again, saw it and said, this isn't the world we want. We want to try to organize to make it different. And they were led by many of the people who were most impacted. One of the most incredible leaders there, a woman named Malia Chun, who is Native Hawaiian, a mother, a cultural practitioner. She lives in one of the most impacted communities. She was one of the leaders of this fight. They brought together an incredible coalition, organized, had public demonstrations for the first time, marches in the street, incredible, brilliant organizing around a set of policies that would have done some common sense things. A buffer zone. If you are a school, if you are a hospital, if you are a place that's particularly vulnerable, that you'll be a buffer zone between you and the fields. 2, that you will let people know what you're going to spray, so that people who are most potentially vulnerable to the spraying could potentially know about it and make the choice to not be there then. 3, that they would actually have investment in a birth defect registry. So these anecdotal stories about birth defects, that would actually be funded by a birth defect registry so that you could actually be tracking it, and a number of other things. Long story short, they organized, and the good news is in 2013, they won this major victory. 3 Hawaiian counties voted for this suite of policies, which would be really exciting, except for what happened next, which is that the chemical industry sued every single one of those counties and said, you can't do this at the county level. You're preempted by state policy. It has to be statewide or nothing. And all of those policies were overturned. But what you learn in organizing is you only lose if you stop fighting. So they didn't stop fighting. They kind of pulled themselves together and they said, okay, so what do we need to do? We need to build political power. They started a training academy to get people to run for office. So they had people who cared about pesticide exposure, that cared about having these companies held accountable, holding seats in power at the city council and other positions of power in elected office. And they organized again. And this is a picture from one of their rallies at the state capitol in Maui. And the good news is they won. They passed the first agricultural ban on the insecticide chlorpyrifos anywhere in the country last summer. This is a picture of the governor signing the bill. They also passed within it a number of these other policies. The buffer zones are in there. The requirement for disclosure is in there. A bunch of other policies got put into place, and they won. And so I end with this strategy because, of course, building political power, I mean, we see it so clearly today, I would say, more than ever, is such a vital part of any change we want to see in the world, and we certainly can see the incredible impact that it had in Hawaii. So I want to close with one final thought to leave you with, which is this picture. Probably, have you all, raise your hand if you've seen this picture before. So imagine there was a time where nobody had seen this picture. Before 1968, 50 plus 1 years ago, before 1968, we had never seen the planet from space. In 1968, Apollo 8 went out into space, and when they got to the far side of the moon, they saw this. They saw this picture. They took this picture. And it was the first time we all could see ourselves like this, that we could see the planet this way, that we could see this place, this home that we have, as what it is, which is this tiny, tiny blue orb floating in the universe. And this picture really helped ignite the imagination of so many people. Many people say it was the birth sort of this modern day environmental movement, that it really helped to strengthen that ecological worldview. But to me, what I really see when I see this picture is, to me, it's the embodiment of this basic idea, which is that simple idea that our planet is an island too. And that what happens in one place, of course, affects every other place. What happens to one people affects all people. And of course, the activists in Hawaii understood this basic truth. Rachel Carson understood this basic truth. Those fighting for these very common sense local bans on pesticides understand this basic truth. And so I just want to leave you with that thought, this thought that here on this planet, that nothing is far away on an island. And so it calls all of us to do what we can to really look at the places in the world and the actions in the world that don't sit right with us, that we don't think is right, and to stand up and to try to change them. So thank you for listening. So I passed around, I think some postcards are going around that has some of the stuff about Real Food Media, which has a bunch of resources for people, including this podcast we do. Included many of the people that have been to this course before have been on our podcast called Real Food Reads. We have a bunch of other resources on our website. And there's also postcards and a sign-up sheet if you want to stay in touch with us. So we have a few minutes for questions, yeah.
Yep, we got about 10 minutes. See one in the back here. Hey there.
If you could again just say your name and where you're from or what part of the food system you play a role in.
Hi, my name is Nana Brichun. I studied plant science and ag science in undergrad, and I have a quick question. Since you talked about Hawaii a lot, could you touch a little bit more on the rainbow papaya? I didn't really hear you talk about that.
Yeah, so it's an interesting, she was asking about the rainbow papaya. So it's one of the very few, and you probably know this if you're asking the question, it's one of the very few kind of other traits in genetically modified foods that we have. So I mentioned most genetically modified organisms are really just engineered with one or both of these traits. But the genetically modified papaya is a unique case, and it was introduced because there was a blight in the papaya in the Hawaiian Islands, and these actually local Hawaiian genetic engineers discovered this genetic engineering technique that would allow the papaya to be resistant to the blight. And the folks that I talked to in the Hawaiian Islands were argued, and I don't know the science enough to know it, but they were saying that they had these local activists and farmers, that they had ecological solutions to deal with that same blight that the industry was saying the only way that we're going to protect the papaya industry is to introduce this genetically modified papaya. And in fact, when I was on the Hawaiian Islands, I ate these organically grown, non-genetically engineered papaya. But I don't know enough about the science to know, to know that debate. What I find interesting about that story of that papaya is that in the narrative about genetically modified foods, I hear that lifted up all the time as this example of, look, this is how genetic modification is so helpful and beneficial when if you look at, I did the math once on like what percent of genetically modified foods for which crops, and it was like 0.0000001% was the genetically modified papaya. So I think it's really important when we think about, what's been the real impact of this technology on food production. It's these other traits that have really done this impact around or increasing of the pesticide use.
Okay.
But thanks for that question.
Anybody
Any questions
else?
on this side?
And thanks everybody again for being here, and the folks from Detroit, coming from Detroit. It's been a pleasure.
So how does decreasing pesticide use affect how how much produce farmers are actually able to produce when they
Yeah.
have to meet certain quotas, and they're already struggling with different changes
Yeah.
of the weather and all these different factors.
Yeah.
And I'm Arham. I'm a student in LSA in biopsychology, cognition, and neuroscience major.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. So, there've been a lot of studies looking at that question because of course we care not just about the quality of the food, and we care not only about these externalities. You know, how does using chemicals in agriculture potentially negatively impact all of these different issues, but also, what about production? Are we going to have enough food if we don't rely on these chemical pesticides? And we've seen from a number of studies all around the world is that that depending on where you are in the world and what your baseline is for how productive your farms are, that actually the introduction of organic farming practices, so actually actively working with natural systems to promote soil fertility, bringing in some of this like farm biodiversity where you're using non-chemical ways to deal with the insects, that you're actually finding, like that study from the University of Essex found that introduction of organic practices dramatically increased the yields on farms that had weren't really adopting best-in-class organic practices. And then they compared that, well, what about the farmers who they had control groups where they're looking at, well, what about the farmers that used the chemicals, the pesticides? And they found that actually yields in many cases were either less or comparable, but what they found is if you look at the economics of it, the farmers who were using the organic practices where there are some inputs that you still have to purchase, but a lot of what you can do is working with the natural systems of your farm to deal with insects, to build soil fertility, to promote increased productivity, to save your own seeds and plant them year after year, versus the farmers who were using those chemical practices where they had to spend money on pesticides, spend money on fertilizers, spend money on seeds. So they were finding economically it was much more economically beneficial to the farmers that were adopting those best-in-class organic practices. There was a really good study, again, for those who really want to dig into this, that just came out 2 weeks ago, where researchers looked at, for the EU, if we looked at this question, so the EU has, high productivity, high yield per acre on a lot of their farms compared to some of the global south countries that were used in that University of Essex study. So they looked at, if we transition to get rid of most chemical pesticides used in the EU over 10 years, are we going to have enough food to feed people in the EU? What's going to happen to yields? And what that study found, so it was really amazing study. What they found that over 10 years, certain crops you would see yields go down, certain crops you would see yields go up. But because you would be transitioning to a food system that emphasizes growing food to feed people, growing more nutritious food, that ultimately you would have more nutrition per acre in the EU, and that ultimately it would benefit the health of the EU population. That you wouldn't sort of be sacrificing on yield and production. But
Let's just take one more short question and
Got
short
one here.
answer.
Okay. Back there. Okay.
Hello, my name is Sonia. I'm a graduate student in environmental engineering. I'm curious if there's any information you could share about how pesticides and genetically modified organisms are being introduced into developing countries, and
Yeah.
if you have seen any impacts of that.
Yeah, so one of the groups that I mentioned, the Agroecology Fund, is a group that I've been working with, and one of the movements that is a part of the Agroecology Fund is a movement called the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, AFSA. And it's a movement of movements, so it's a movement bringing together farmer advocacy groups really across the continent. And what they have been trying to share with the sort of the global media and sort of, again, sort of in that narrative change work that they've been trying to share is how much progress they're making with these farmer-to-farmer education efforts, with the promotion of agroecological solutions. They're seeing incredible benefits to soil health, to productivity, to to also really being able to create more crops that are more resilient to climate change. They're seeing all of these incredible benefits. But what they are up against is a very well-funded effort to actually push more pesticides, synthetic fertilizer, and GMOs into the areas where they're working. And the narrative that I feel like we hear in this country is that those of us who are opposed to GMOs are responsible for people starving in Africa because they're not able to get this technology because activists are against GMOs. In fact, I was at an industry conference once, food industry conference once. There was a panel about GMOs, and somebody actually said, those who are opposed to genetically modified organisms should be tried for crimes against humanity. And people were like, yes, all right, you're totally right. And I wanted to jump up and say, why don't you actually talk to organizers in the Global South who are trying to create food systems that work for them, and ask them if they feel like they're being sort of left out of some big miracle solution. Because what we see, is what have GMOs done to farmers in this country? Do we have a thriving rural America? Are farmers doing well? Are they, more profitable than ever? Are our waterways clean? Is our food healthy? Are our farm workers, the healthiest people in the country? What we can see, farm workers are the most exposed to pesticides. Farmers are being impoverished by this reliance on expensive chemicals and expensive seeds. And so I think part of it is really trying to help groups like the Alliance for the Food Sovereignty in Africa be able to get their story out about the work that they're doing on the ground. So I know it's like 7:59. So good, folks. Thank you all for being here.